Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for another episode of our podcast, Talk to the Author, a casual chat with a business book author, hosted by our co-founder, Ron, with our special guest today, Peter Tertzakian. Before we start, let me introduce myself. My name is Rosemary Forget, and I am the office manager here at Resource YYC. We are a co-working space for professionals, so if you're looking for a flexible office space to work for the day or on a monthly basis, this is the right place for you. We do also provide virtual office services to give you flexibility in your hybrid working world. Virtual offices are great if you don't want to use your home address for your business. And we'll be sharing some links if you're interested in checking us out. Please be aware that the session is recorded, and later on our members will have a chance to ask questions. So hold them until later. And so with that, let's begin. Over to you, Ron.
Thanks, Rosemary, and thanks everyone who's joined us live and also listening on the podcast. So I'm Ron Bettine, co-founder of Resource YYC, and purpose of this series, again, as Rosemary said, it's really to actually introduce some of our members and some of the guests to business book authors in Calgary. Sometimes we're actually introducing new authors. I think this time a lot of you know the author, so it's a chance to talk about Peter's book. As personally, I do some consulting in the energy industry, so I'm looking forward to this discussion today. There's lots of great topics and very pertinent topics for us to talk about today. So, and then again, for those that are live, when the podcast ends, we'll have a chance for some Q&A with Peter. So it's my pleasure to welcome you here today, Peter.
Great. Yeah, thanks very much. Pleasure to be here.
Good. And Peter's Peter's the deputy director of ARC Energy Research Institute. He's a public speaker, podcaster, blogger, and of course an author. In 2015, Peter was actually seconded to the 4-person royalty review panel for the province of Alberta. So he knows the fiscal policies of Alberta inside and out through the ups and downs. And also in 2016, he was inducted to the Alberta Petroleum Hall of Fame. So this is a first for us on our podcast. I don't know if we've had a Hall of Famer before, so this is a highlight for us. And then also in 2021, he joined the Institute of Sustainable Finance Advisory Board. He's also chair of the board of Contemporary Calgary Art Gallery. So just a bit, maybe just a part of the introduction, you've written 3 books, 1,000 Barrels a Second, The End of Energy Obesity, and most recently, the book we're going to talk about is Investors Visit and Other Stories, Disruption, Denial, and Transition in the Energy Business. And it's a little different style. So, you know what, your great storytelling approach and mixing history with evidence-based research, you're kind of a bit of the Malcolm Gladwell of the energy industry. So it's great. I think it catches lots of attention, and I've been fortunate to hear you speak. I think, as early as 20 years ago, and there's some little pearls of wisdom you had back then, and I expect that we'll have some pearls of wisdom today. So welcome to our podcast, Peter.
Great. Thanks again.
Yeah. And so maybe actually, so that was a bit of the high level of your journey, but personally, can you maybe tell us a bit about your personal journey that started your career and ended up in where you're at today, and kind of ended up writing books about the energy industry?
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to do that. I'm generally a fairly private person, if you know me. But happy to share with you the journey, as you call it. So I grew up in a pretty technical household. My father was a PhD scientist, so there wasn't a lot of question in the minds of the household that I would go into the sciences, and that's what I did. So I went to the U of A Department of Physics and basically took physics for a couple of years. Realized back then there wasn't a lot of jobs for physicists, but there was this thing called the oil and gas industry that was hiring. And if I took a couple of geology courses, I could get by and get a job in the oil and gas industry, which is what I did. And so moved to Calgary when I was 20 from Edmonton, and spent 10 really formative years in the business. And they were formative for 2 reasons. One, they really honed the application of quantitative numerical processes. And my minor was really in computing science at the time. So did a lot of algorithm development. So I was really a nerdy sort of person, frankly. And if the phone rang, I'd be scared to answer it. So it's somewhat shocking to know that I'm here today on this thing, or I go on stages and speak sometimes to a couple thousand people. But, the formative thing was I was dispatched to the field for 2 or 3 years. And when that happened, I was forced to get out of my shell and just deal with a whole new constituency of people. And I really have warm memories of working up north, across the country, all the way from Prince Edward Island to northern Canada, and just meeting all sorts of interesting people. And it just forced me to be more outgoing. So that's fine until sort of the late 80s and early 1990s, when those of you who were in the business and remember the business know that it was a pretty brutal time in terms of the industry and the layoffs and so on and so forth. So anyway, long story short, I left the business and I went and became an entrepreneur in the world of biotech, believe it or not, knowing nothing about biotechnology. Anyway, cut the long story short, that led me to go and do an MBA in the business of technology and finance. And that was another formative moment. So I did that, came back to Calgary, and that's really when I started to migrate more into the world of finance, where I still am today. But it was also a time where I started tapping into my creative side of my head, because to this point, as I said, I was sort of a very technical, nerdy sort of person. But within me, I felt that there was a creative thing, which was quite surprising, frankly, because I was on the verge of failing English 100, and here I am, a writer. So I spent quite a bit of time now thinking about writing and how to write well. And that led me to the first book in 2005, 1,000 Barrels a Second, the second book in 2009, End of Energy, Obesity. And then that led into the book that we're talking about. So I don't know, that's sort of a snapshot. There's really two sides of me. I would say the first half of my adult life, I spent very technical, and then I transitioned, and the second half of my life and now is much more creative, very creatively oriented. So I've got the two.
We could probably do a whole podcast on your transition, because so many of our members, and one of the reasons Resource YYC exists is for professionals, and a lot of them are going through transition and starting a new career as an entrepreneur or their own consulting business. So we're here to talk about the book, but I actually think that's a great story, because there's so many people right now that are going through, either by choice or by force, through transition. So I appreciate you sharing that, Peter. And you're actually now, from being someone who didn't want to speak publicly, you're doing some pretty amazing stuff. You co-host the ARC Energy Ideas podcast, and you're really talking about current topics. So how do you find that experience, hosting the podcast and really having some great conversations with some really relevant people in the industry?
Yeah, it's great to be able to do that. And again, the transition part that you speak about is like super important, because it's not like you wake up one day and convert yourself from a very technical person to somebody who speaks in front of a microphone or somebody who writes. It takes practice. It takes a commitment to learn it. One of my I guess core values is I'm going to do something, I'm going to do it right. And so my personality is such as when I decide to do something, I go all in and try and learn. So sort of give you a sense of that. When the first two books, 1,000 Barrels a Second and End of Energy, Obesity, were written in more or less a traditional business book genre, typically 70,000 word book, and follows a certain prescription in terms of charts, graphs, anecdotes in between, with some conclusions throughout. But to write the book, The Investor Visit, I wanted to test something very different. And we can talk about why if you like. But I wanted to test the idea of whether we could write a business book in the form of creative nonfiction, which is a completely different genre of writing. And so in that transition, as I said, in my personality to go all in, I actually hired 2 independent coaches, writing coaches. And I didn't let one or the other know about each other.
Oh, wow.
And I started writing, and they gave me feedback, some of which was brutal, which was good. Because if you're going to transition, you have to be able to take criticism, especially if you want to excel. And so I looked at the 2 critiques, and there was probably about 70% overlap, but one of the coaches gave me a different kind of critique and the other, and between the 2 I triangulated and practiced. And then, you know, the book, The Investor Visit, I mean, that took, by the time beginning to end, it took 7-8 years to write.
Well, and it looked like there's clearly a path. So first of all, your first book, you kind of knocked out of the park with 1,000 barrels per second. So so anything after that would be hard to live up to. But like clearly in there was some threads of what turned out to be the story. So were you thinking the entire time about these type of stories, or did you have those concepts that you were looking for a different platform to talk about?
Yeah. Well, there's an overarching formula, I'll call it, and the overarching formula that I used, whether it was on stage making a presentation or in my writings, was take an anecdote from the past, juxtapose it to the present, and then draw conclusions and inferences about where we may go forward. In other words, we've seen that movie before. Let's apply it to today and sort of opine on where we're going to go going forward. And so that formula actually has a lot of powerful things, because of course it lends itself to storytelling, especially when you're talking about past anecdotes. Like, the thing that I found over the years of presenting and writing was that there's another very important thing that comes from talking about the past, and almost like a reminiscence, and that is that it helps to calm people down, especially during periods of anxiety, you know, because especially, I mean, if you think about even now, it's sort of like everything's coming at you and say, well, I'm confused as hell. What am I going to do? And if you walk into a boardroom or virtual meeting or whatever, there's just sort of this anxiety and tenseness. If the meeting starts out with an anecdote about the past that can be juxtaposed as a metaphor of what's happening today, it calms people down, right? It says, oh, you mean we've seen this before? So yeah, we've seen it before. Let's talk about it. And so not only is it more engaging, but it actually has the secondary and I would argue more important effect of calming people down.
Well, it's amazing the perspective it puts on things, because you and I chatted just before this that period between 1880s to the 1920s has so many parallels to what we're going through now, that you start to put some perspective on and start to realize that actually, you know, everything we do now, it seems like we can be the only generation going through these kind of changes. But when you look at it in perspective of what was going on then, it's almost even more dramatic, because I feel now we can almost conceive what technology could do, right? It's unbelievable when we get it, but it's actually conceivable. Some of the stuff that happened then was actually almost unconceivable, and they had to live through it, right?
Oh, for sure. The parallels are staggering. That's why it's my favorite period in energy history, 1880 to 1920, because we saw the transition from oil lighting, gas lighting, which is a combustion-based process, to electrification, which everybody talks about today, and electric lighting and electric appliances. We saw the transition from, in mobility, from horse and buggy, a 5,000-year-old established paradigm, to motor cars powered by petroleum. And so here we are 100 years later, we're talking about electrification, we're talking about changing out the mobility paradigm. So, and the business, what's always great for me to study and bring forward as I say, this juxtaposition is that the business techniques that were used are almost identical to what we see today in terms of the incumbent versus the newcomer that's trying to displace the old with the new, and so on and so forth. So we can talk more about that, but those are some of the themes actually that's
yeah, well, I was gonna say
that are in the book. Right?
It's a perfect segue into the book. So it's actually, the book is 10 stories. And you call yourself a bit of you're a combination between an energy tourist and an energy historian, which really actually is, I guess, how you ended up with stories. So maybe actually I want to talk about a few stories, but maybe just talk about how you've turned your love of history and some of that energy history and some of the traveling you've done. You've really combined them into the actual stories that you wrote.
Yeah, so the history combined with the travel really goes nicely together, especially when you go to places that have undergone one or multiple transitions, like Europe, where you have a fairly rich history. The UK started the Industrial Revolution. I mean, you can clearly even see in the museums, but even on the streets, the buildings that are still around, how they've transitioned over the course of the last couple of 100 years. So I always tell people, a picture or a photograph is worth 1,000 spreadsheets.
Yeah.
Right. And so people have this is coming from a guy, as I said, who's very numerical. And I learned, started learning about 20, 25 years ago that, okay, time to close the spreadsheet and just look around you, because there's so much to see, and it's almost a reality check. And I think that's really one of the perils that I see today is everybody's got their head in the spreadsheet.
Yeah.
And isn't sort of just looking out the window to see the realities of what's going on. And then you look at whether it's old paintings in a museum, which are reflective of the times, to photographs, to old buildings and architecture, and you can clearly see the transitions. And then you go do the research and the history, and you find out all the parallels that we're facing today.
And so you, so reading your book, it sounds like you actually have quite a collection of energy memorabilia and history there. Have you been doing that the whole time through your career, or is that part of the research for this book?
A combination of both. I started collecting obscure energy things like old antique light bulbs and things. Probably that was probably in the actually it was the early to mid 1990s. But when I started writing, I realized that collecting more is useful.
Yeah.
And it's also, I found, very useful because when I stood on stage to tell an anecdote, say about the transition from gas lighting to electric lighting, and people would nod their heads and go, "Oh yeah, Peter, that's really interesting. Thank you for that anecdote and how you presented it." But it becomes doubly more powerful if you then pull out the light bulb and say, "Here it is."
Yeah.
Right. And because it becomes tangible. And when things become tangible, as I said earlier, people view the problem differently, and they tend to calm down and are much more open to discussing in a non-confrontational manner if it's a contentious issue.
Actually, I want to talk about one of your stories because a good majority of the people in Calgary have been out to Banff and Lake Minnewanka, and you tell a story about the demise of coal mine number 80 at Bankhead, Alberta in 1922, right? And that was a mining town of about 1,500 people. And it's not, all that's left is ruins. And I did like that story because for anyone who's been there, you actually walk through the same journey, just walking through there, except you actually wove in the entire history of why that came to being. So you want to tell us a bit about that background, that story?
Yeah. So, I mean, you don't have to go to Europe to see energy transition.
Yeah.
Alberta has a rich history of energy transition. I mean, before we became a province, we were dominantly an agrarian society, and then we switched to coal, and then from coal to petroleum, and then now we're transitioning again. So you can clearly see the evidence in the old ghost towns. And so I knew of Bankhead. I'd been there a couple of times, obviously being a Calgarian. Although it's just remarkable, not a lot of Calgarians even know it's there.
They've probably driven by it.
Yeah, but so if you are on the way to Lake Minnewanka and see a little brown or sign that says Bankhead, go take a look, and it's a very interesting little outdoor museum and a hike, because was one of the coal mines, of many coal mines that was in the area and around the Canmore area. And so what really got me thinking as I went through Bankhead was around 2015-16, which was a brutal time here, not too long ago in the oil business, thinking, wow, you know, all the layoffs and all the talk about the end of oil and blah, blah, blah. And thinking, okay, well, have we seen this movie before here? Yes, we have. And so here's Bankhead, which went into demise because it was a high cost producer, because it didn't have market access. It was being displaced by diesel locomotives. You know, Bankhead was set up in large part by the Banff Springs Hotel to be a stop for the coal locomotives, the steam engines coming through. But when the diesel engines start coming through, well, why do we need that? So, you know, it had all the elements of the narratives that we were hearing in 15, 16, 17. I thought, well, let's write it up. But, you know, I also realized, like, if you go to a place by Drumheller, like the Atlas coal mine, I mean, it stuck around till the 1980s. So why did it survive, and why did Bankhead fail? And so, you know, the story is about Bankhead and demise of an industry and all the things.
And it had so many layers. I mean, you actually talked to, so at that time it died, yet that energy transformation, coal stick around for a long time, right? So I mean, you know, and coal, we still talk about coal today, right? In fact, when we're kind of reading that story, it actually felt for sure to those people at Bankhead that coal was dead.
Right.
Shockingly, coal is not dead. And actually, I'm curious, a little side, why didn't the transition completely happen away from coal into hydrocarbons?
Well, it's just the same as, you know, it's a perfect metaphor even for what we can expect going forward. Is that, as I said, the Bankhead coal mine was a high cost producer. It didn't have good market access. It was in the wrong geography. And so, you know, compared to other coal mines, some in the Drumheller area that stuck around till almost 1980. And then in the Grand Cache area, I mean, they just shut it down only a couple of years ago. So just because Bankhead went into demise didn't mean the whole industry went into demise. In fact, the demand for coal grew. So it really was a lesson that I also took into account. You mentioned the royalty review. I said, you know, we are a high cost jurisdiction in this province. And if we don't get our costs down, we are going to, many of us feel the same fate as Bankhead, and we're going to have a lot of those communities. So when we were designing the new fiscal regime, so there has to be an incentive for companies to reduce their costs. And that would, you know, that resonated. You know,
actually, I mean, you're actually starting to answer the question I had was, so who are the Bankheads today, and what can we do not to be a Bankhead, right? Like, well, you know, I'm not personally, but from an industry perspective.
Yeah, well, you know, there's the perception of the, say, oil industry, which is perceived to be one big homogeneous blob, is completely wrong in terms of the interpretation. I mean, there's a wide spectrum of petroleum products with a wide spectrum of producers, with a wide spectrum of cost structures, and so on and so forth. So, you know, who are the Bankheads of today? The Bankheads of today are the producing segment that's still high cost, I would argue. And we would layer on top of that now today, the ones that are not paying attention to the trends of decarbonization and so on, because for them, it's going to get higher and higher cost. And if you don't adapt to the future, you're not going to make it.
No, that's totally true. Actually, the next story, actually, one last question, the Stairway to Hell. Why do you name it Stairway to Hell?
Well, if you go to Bankhead, and you have to look for it because it's not obvious, but there was a church on a hill, which was very well documented in the historical materials. And it actually took me a couple of trips to actually find it. And it's actually not far off the highway, which speaks to my ability to find things. But anyway, I did find it. And all that's left is the foundation and the stairway.
Yeah.
And that was affectionately called, still is, for those who know it, the Stairway to Heaven.
Yeah.
Right. But I just said, well, I'm going to call this story Stairway to Hell, because it really was a tragic story where 4,000 people lost their jobs and they had to be displaced. And it was all based on, as I mentioned in the story, a strategy of hope.
Yeah.
You know, I hope things get better. I hope prices go up again. I hope this, I hope that. And it didn't. It ended up being, for those community members and the families, kind of a hellish story.
Yeah, and for those, I'm going to leave as a bit of a teaser. For those who read it, you actually intertwine some personal stories of people who worked there that were just as tragic,
Mm-hmm.
the life they lived and how they had to work there. So we'll yeah, well maybe we'll let people read it to find out some of those details, because actually that's what I did appreciate about most of your stories. You tie in the personal story of an individual. And just actually for time, I'm going to move on to the next one. So this one feels like it's the long way around story, and it feels like it could be a story of today. It's it's about a 14,000 kilometer journey of a Greek oil tanker to transport Alberta oil to from the port of Vancouver to, of all places, Montreal. This took place during the 1973 Arab oil embargo, and there's worldwide energy shortage, and it changed a lot of things, and it seemed to me that it should have changed more things, but that story feels all too familiar now. So maybe do you want to tell us a bit about how you wrote it?
Yeah. Well, the story points out the absurdity of the situation, because even back in 1973, Canada was theoretically self-sufficient in oil. In other words, it produced more oil than it consumed. But we weren't self-sufficient because there was no pipeline of any meaningful quantity from Alberta to central Canada.
Mm-hmm.
And as we know, there still isn't.
Yeah.
And so when the Arab oil embargo and the oil price shocks of the 1970s came about, central Canada was short of oil. Everybody was hoarding in the world. And so the oil was tankered through the Trans Mountain pipeline, loaded up in Vancouver on board there was two Greek tankers that were used. So this is a story of the captain of one of those Greek tankers. And it transited through the Panama Canal all the way around and into the port of Montreal. Actually, it's even more circuitous than that, but that's the basic story.
Yeah.
And so the absurdity of that was, I wrote that and published it, and the book was published in, it was 2020. It was only a few months after where I think it was Cenovus basically said, we're sending oil through that same route to the Irving oil refinery. Okay, so I think, I'm just going to tell you that we are just as vulnerable today. If the Russians attack Ukraine and there's a global oil shortage, there's no plan B for central Canada.
And
still, after 40 years.
And we are, like, it becomes into percentages of supply that's a bit of the tipping point, right? Between thinking we're self-sufficient or having a supply to actually an energy crisis, right? Which even at that time, I don't think it was, like, the total amount was about a 10% change in supply, right? But that was enough to send us into a crisis, right?
It was, yeah. I mean, there was hoarding, the freeways were empty. It didn't last that long, but long enough to cause major disruptions. And as I said, like, we are completely vulnerable in central Canada.
Yeah.
So not only could the supply be cut off, but there's only two countries in the world that do not have a strategic petroleum reserve. In other words, a reserve, and that is Canada and Norway.
No kidding.
And we didn't build it because we thought we were self-sufficient. Every other country in the OECD built one. So, it's just, anyway, I could go on, and I don't raise your blood pressure, everybody on this call.
No,
but I'm not, it's shocking. And if line 5 gets cut, that's the other thing, same problem.
It's frustrating even to think about it. You did a great job at capturing the story, but it's just all too relevant, which makes it a perfect read. There's a perfect case where history, combining history, and I wouldn't necessarily say this one gave me a calming effect. It actually was, oh my goodness, it's just as bad, and perhaps with what's happening in Russia and all these things right now, it's perhaps just right around the corner again, right?
We're exceedingly vulnerable
Yeah.
in this country with supply chain of energy. Yeah.
Is there any bright spot, or is it just the same?
From insulating ourselves or insuring ourselves against potential global supply disruption, no, honestly, there's none. I can't honestly paint a rosy picture at all, because now we are East Central Canada is dominantly supplied by the Americans.
Yeah.
And we know what happened. We got a taste of it with the pandemic, with vaccines in the early days. When the vaccines started coming out, there was hoarding.
Yeah.
And so if there's global oil supply shortages, it's every country for themselves.
There's a whole other podcast, and it strikes me as one of the things we talk about, but hopefully it's change. I don't know. Well, maybe actually let's talk about one more story, because it might actually help to, I guess the positive story is we're still a very oil dependent world. So transitioning, I guess in the long run, some transition all away from oil adds security. And I actually pulled up a story from, not from your book, but it's along the same lines, from Energyphile.
Mm-hmm.
And it's about reinventing the wheel. And it's your story. It's actually, I like the way your stories do, because it started with a trip to Heritage Park, right? So right away you can relate to Heritage Park, and you're inspired to write about the Canadian McLaughlin Carriage Company and their transition, right? So maybe actually, and I guess going from how depressing it is that we haven't changed anything on security, this is a story about transition with a positive outcome, and it was a positive outcome for a Canadian company. So you mind telling us a bit about that story there?
Yeah, I will. Just, minor side point, the positive side to this whole oil story, and oil at $90 is, it's just basically another bonanza for Alberta.
Yeah.
And, that's a whole subject for another podcast. But, when you get high oil prices and you get high gasoline prices, then there's greater incentive to switch to alternatives, and alternatives like electric vehicles and so on. So this story talks not about the consumer switching modes of modality, which is which is another story in the book. It's the great aha. This is a story about producers of vehicle switching. And so the story is about Robert McLaughlin, who came over from Ireland in the 1850s to Ontario, was a farmer, started making sleds in his barn, and then starts making carriages. I think the long story short is that they were high quality, and he decided to set up shop, and making horse and buggies, becomes one of the largest horse and buggy manufacturers in the world. Sets up moves the factory to Oshawa, which is now the heart of the auto industry. His CFO sees a car, like a Model T, driving by, says, well, I think we better start thinking about changing, because the world's changing. Well, you can read the story, but this is a remarkable story of a corporate pivot, of how a company that was one of the largest carriage makers in the world proactively switches over to become an automaker. And spoiler alert, but basically becomes General Motors Canada.
Yeah, and you know what I liked about this story is you actually paralleled the path of two employees, one with a real open mindset to change, and the other was quite satisfied where he was at. And it, I'm not sure if those characters really existed, but it is a bit of a story about people in general, right?
Yeah.
Adopting change and it's exactly, maybe definitely around cars, but there's so many technologies now that we kind of have these two paths of attitudes of people going in, and it's a conflict actually from people who are just not quite willing to accept change, right? So So maybe just tell me about how you why you wrote those two characters in there.
Yeah, those, and they are based, it is historical nonfiction. So the two
Yeah.
characters are made up in my head as,
Yeah.
but so there's two themes
Yeah.
here that I play off each other. One is the remarkable corporate pivot and what it took to, as I say in the book, get off a 5,000-year-old paradigm of horses and chariots and buggies to motorized vehicles, right? And it would take incredible fortitude, especially if your company is in the peak of its sales, 14,000 carriages a year, and you say, okay, we got to change. Because most companies, it's too late, right? They're reactive. But I wanted to explore also something that I was certainly witnessing in all the presentations that I make to companies and the interactions. And that is, this whole idea of disruption, denial, and transition. I wanted to focus in on the denial of corporate culture that you have to change. Because, I was intrigued by what it would have to take for a company of that size to change its culture very quickly.
Yeah.
And so you think about this company, it's, for 50 years, it was one of the premier and then largest maker of carriages. So hugely successful. And then it pivots and then it becomes General Motors Canada.
Yeah.
Another success story. Like, I don't know of many, if any, companies that have been able to.
No, and the technology part of it is so, it was literally technology that changed.
Yeah.
They got on board for the whole company. And there's all those stories of companies that didn't understand the technology change that was happening around them. And it's, in hindsight, it's 2020 vision, right? Well, how could they not know, right? And I'm picturing, so there's a bit of this happening in oil and gas companies around trying to understand the technology, and it changes around greenhouse gases and zero carbon. And then personally, there's a lot of people trying to understand the change for transportation and automobiles. And this kind of had both, right?
Yeah.
So maybe actually if we parse it apart, how did companies, and if you're making good money right now in Alberta, you're making good money on oil and gas, right? Oil, because the price have come up.
Yeah, more than ever.
On the horizon, it looks like there is a transformation happening, or you don't think it's going to happen, right? So what are your thoughts around where oil and gas companies and energy companies are at today around that?
Well, again, there's a whole spectrum of type of companies: gas, oil, bitumen, you name it, midstream, downstream, upstream. And so, I tell people I do use this story as a learning thing, much like I do with the other stories as well. So like, what's the business lesson out of this? And you say, imagine you're sitting around the boardroom table with Sam McLaughlin, who was Robert's son. Robert's son took over the company and led this transition. And you can imagine the conversation is, okay, we've got 4 wheels and a steering wheel. What can we do with them? Right? That's what we're good at. And I said, okay, well, let's just sort of swap out the engine and create a new kind of mobility. Okay, I'm just being a little bit facetious, but now you think about an oil and gas company and say, okay, what are you good at? Well, we've got 4 carbons and a hydrogen. What else can we do with this thing? We're good at poking holes in the ground. We're good at manipulating molecules that have carbon in it. So let's adapt to the new world. And, everybody's got a different circumstance, as I say, but I don't have all the answers, but you got to think.
No, but actually I'm curious. Actually, this is one thing, is how do you deal with the question, right? Because I think a lot of them are dealing with the question of hydrogen, geothermal, lithium. These are actually all things that I think Albertans, especially from the energy industry, have tremendous skills at, but can't quite see that path. I'm sure someday we'll look back and say there was an obvious path, but right now they're kind of grappling where it is. And where do you see some of those technologies actually maybe playing a role for transition for energy companies?
Yeah, I think the good news is we are on the path. This whole, recognizing that the book, The Investor Visit, was written, and the stories in it was written dominantly between sort of 2014, 2019, that this was a very difficult period. And so the subtitle was the one, disruption, denial, and transition.
Yeah.
So we were being disrupted. We're lots of people, and the employees and the culture was in denial. But I felt like by the time the book was released, and certainly now, we're definitely in the transition mindset. It's just that we need to communicate to others that we're in the transition mindset because they don't believe us.
Yeah.
But things are happening quite rapidly.
Yeah.
And people are thinking finally out of the barrel, as I like to say, and getting quite excited about the possibilities. So unlike other industries, I would tell you that who are still in the disruption denial phase, I think Alberta and its industries have come through 7 or 8 very hard years.
Yeah.
And that has served to take us to that transition side of things.
Well, I'm encouraged and actually quite interested to see how things like around the Edmonton, the hydrogen hub around Edmonton, there's a lot of things that we actually are kind of world leaders in. I don't think a lot of people know that. Yeah. CCUS. Do you see us becoming world leaders in some of these things, this technologies out of Alberta?
Well, I do, with a caveat. I mean, we have to think holistically and put into place the right policy levers and environment.
Yeah.
The good news is that we have something now that we didn't have even a year ago, and that is more capital to play with, because the price of oil where it is just and gas is just sort of generating cash flow. The question is, how do we channel that money, much as the McLaughlins did, into the future? And it's not necessarily CCS; it's all sorts of other possibilities that we can think of. Some of which I haven't thought of, but I mean, this is a whiteboard moment.
Yeah, right? I mean, it's pretty exciting as long as you're not the carriage maker, right?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, saying the danger with the situation that we're in right now is, oh great, oil prices, gas prices are back up, they're really high, so guess what, we're back to 2012 and the good times. Well, you can't think that way, because some of the carriage makers did think that way, and they didn't end up there was those consolidated carriage companies, which was in the story, and of course it didn't survive.
So I picked out 3 stories because I thought they're remarkably just parallels to today. You got lots of other stories, and we talked before, you've with your website Energyphile, which I'd encourage people to go, you're actually starting to build a repository. Future book, what's the future plans, Peter?
Yeah, so if you go to Energyphile, that's energy, Phile, as in aficionado of energy.
Yeah.
Passionate about energy, energyphile.org. You will find all the stories and a whole bunch of other stuff. The McLaughlin story is the 11th story. It is not on print, but it's on the website and you can read it. And I encourage you actually to listen to the audio, because we had the audio recorded professionally with voice actors in a studio, and I think they're fabulous. The plans are to, because things have been so busy and so many things going on, I had to pause the addition of the materials, the cards, the vignettes, as we call them, the stories, but hopefully this year I'm going to start that back up and write complete. I've got several on the table, complete more stories, and then publish them as a separate binding. So that's where it's headed.
I'll be looking forward to them. I actually think especially the storytelling style stands out amongst all the traditional books, and actually they actually stand up for the test of time, right? Because you are relating things. So there's so many books that are current for the moment. Basing them on that history is current for a long time. So I appreciate that. I'm actually we don't want to leave a little time for questions, but is there anything, and I could go on and on here, is there anything that we haven't talked about that you think could be worth sharing with some of our members and the listeners?
I think we covered a lot. I mean, go to the Energyphile site, especially what we call the viewport or the file space, the portal with the cards, because I think, Ron, you just touched on something really important, is that a lot of business books, by the time they're published, they go out of date. And that's one of the reasons why I decided to use the short story method. And so the philosophy behind the short stories is that they are more like distantly like a Aesop fable, where they're timeless. And that made it actually doubly difficult to write, is that I wanted somebody to be able to pick it up 25, 30, 50 years from now and still be able to take that business or societal lesson away. It would be timeless.
And they're great read because you wove in the people, like it's very personal, some of the stories.
Yeah.
So for nothing else, it's just like a really good piece of fables. There's just a really good story, and there's something interesting to read, but the layers of it are like there's multiple layers in some of those stories. So yeah, keep it up. I'll be
thanks.
I've been listening to your podcast, and they are professionally done. The podcasts are great. And again, you have your ARC Energy podcasts once a week or once a month?
Yeah, it's once a week.
Once
That's
a week
with my colleague at ARC Financial, my day job. With,
and I suspect some of them I've listened to were current at the moment, and the world changed by the next month. So so they're a great listen too. So Peter, thank you very much for spending the time with us today. I sure appreciate it. I'm going to hand it off to Rosemary, and once we've ended the podcast, we'll have some time for question and answers of people who are live.
Great. Thank you.
All right. Thank you again, Peter. And that was a great talk. So, and thank you everyone for listening. And if you get the chance, check out Resource YYC. All right. Have a good evening. Bye.